June in Burkina Faso was scorching. The air hung thick, like even the sky had stopped breathing. But it wasn't the heat that terrified the people, it was the silence. No rumbling tractors, no smoke curling from the coffee roasters in the outskirts of Bobo Dioulasso. Ripe coffee cherries dropped to the ground, rotting at the base of their own trees. The fields were barren. The machines stood still, and the farmers, millions of them, were left with nothing but the sound of their own hunger. It happened overnight. A cold directive from the West. A trade blockade signed and sealed. All agricultural machinery exports to Burkina Faso are suspended immediately. Short, brutal, surgical. No one was ready. The last tractors wheezed to a stop as spare parts dried up. Coffee processing plants shut their gates. The harvest couldn't be picked. The land couldn't be tilled. A nation that had just started to rise was brought to its knees. But then a whisper cut through the despair. Ibrahim is not staying silent. He's doing something big. 3 days later, the national TV broadcast a scene that froze the country in awe. No suits, no grand speeches, just Ibrahim Traoré, still in military fatigues, standing in the middle of an empty field. Behind him, cranes were lifting steel beams into the sky. We do not wait. We do not beg. From today, our tractors will be made by Burkina Faso. No one dared believe it. But when the sparks started flying and the machines began to roar, the people knew the crisis didn't arrive with bombs or gunfire. It came in the form of silence. The kind of silence that spreads like rot across a field. Within days of the embargo, thousands of hectares of farmland lay abandoned. Farmers stood at the edge of their plots, staring as if they were mourning their own future. In the dry northern plains of Kaya Old Issouf, a farmer pushing 70 dragged his rusty tractor onto the field. He checked the oil pumped, the fuel turned the ignition. The engine coughed twice and died like a final breath. He sat down in the dirt and whispered, "They've strangled a nation by taking our knives and our plows." But it wasn't just agriculture that died. The entire economy built around farming collapsed like a sandcastle in a storm. Coffee cooperatives shut down. Processing plants locked their gates. Thousands of workers were laid off. The price of coffee beans crashed from 400 CFA to 90 CFA per kilo. But the real heartbreak wasn't the money, it was watching people throw coffee into the river like trash. In Banfora, the coffee heart of Burkina Faso, trucks, piled with ripe beans, rolled toward the riverbanks. Men, women, even children silently unloaded sack after sack and dumped them into the muddy current. The sour stench of rotting coffee filled the air. It smelled like defeat. No one wept for lost profit. They wept for something worse. The feeling of being crushed, not with bullets but with silence. And everywhere the same angry questions echoed. Why are they afraid of our tractors? Why has coffee become a crime? When will we finally control our own lives? The questions hung in the air like wounds that wouldn't close. And as fingers pointed toward the west, eyes began to turn toward one man, the only man who had ever said no to the IMF, who returned World Bank loans without blinking, who slashed minister salaries by 30%, Ibrahim Traoré. As a nation fell to its knees, stripped of its tools to survive, people realized this was no longer just about farming. This was a battle for the right to stand tall. While foreign media debated whether Burkina Faso would collapse under the weight of the embargo inside the country, something far more dangerous than despair was stirring resolve. President Ibrahim Traoré didn't call for a press conference. He didn't issue a long-winded address or appeal to international agencies. He disappeared from the cameras for 6 days. No one saw him. No one heard from him. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said he had left the capital. Others whispered that he was in a secret military meeting. But in truth, he was walking village to village, town to town, talking to the very people who were hurting the most. At dawn on the 7th day, a convoy of old military trucks rolled into a vast, empty field near Dori. There were no flags, no photographers, just steel beams, welding torches, concrete mixers, and Ibrahim Traoré in a dusty uniform sleeves, rolled up holding the blueprint for what would become the most controversial structure in the country's modern history, the National Tractor Factory of Burkina Faso. His first words to the crew were simple: "We don't wait, we build, from scratch if we have to." And that's exactly what they did. Awar Laos. From dust to assembly line construction began with little more than recycled steel sand from the desert and the sweat of hundreds of volunteers. Engineers from Ouagadougou University were flown in on cargo planes. Retired mechanics, machinists, and even blacksmiths came out of retirement. No one asked about salary. No one complained about the heat. It was war, just without bullets. 3 weeks later, the first test frames for a plowing machine were welded together. The factory floor was still half a skeleton, but Traoré insisted on installing the prototype right there under the blazing sun. The goal wasn't perfection, it was proof. Proof that Burkina Faso didn't need hand-me-downs from Europe to survive. Soon the plant became more than a construction site. It became a symbol. Villagers came by the hundreds to see the rising machines. Children climbed onto scaffolding to watch the sparks fly. Women brought pots of rice and mango stew for the workers. The military guarded the perimeter not from enemies, but from an overwhelming wave of citizens who just wanted to be part of something bigger. News spread fast, not through official channels but through phone calls, encrypted messages, and word of mouth. Ibrahim is building tractors, here, ours, with our hands. Toward the moment the engine roared. After 72 days of non-stop labor, the first tractor rolled out. It was loud, clunky, and painted in a shade of red that looked suspiciously like leftover military paint. But when the engine turned over, and the wheels crushed their first pile of sand, the entire crowd erupted. It wasn't just the sound of an engine, it was the sound of independence. Ibrahim stood beside it, a hand on the steering wheel, as cameras captured the moment. He looked into the lens and said only one sentence: "We will never starve again because someone else holds the key to our tools." The video went viral, across the continent. From Nairobi to Lagos, Kinshasa, to Bamako, young Africans shared the clip with captions like, "A real leader." "We need factories, not aid. This is how we fight back." For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso wasn't trending because of a coup or crisis. It was trending because it dared to make its own machines. Scaling the revolution. Within 3 months, the factory was producing 25 tractors per week. The models were basic, stripped down, built for function over form, but they worked. And they were built to survive Burkina Faso's unforgiving terrain. But Traoré didn't stop there. He authorized the expansion of the factory to include coffee processing machinery. The idea was radical: if the West won't sell us machines, we'll make machines that make coffee. This wasn't just industrial progress, it was economic defiance. It was a declaration that Africa doesn't need permission to innovate. Investors laughed. Western analysts called it unsustainable. But across West Africa, something new was happening. Delegations from Mali, Niger, Chad, and even Senegal began visiting the facility. They weren't just curious, they were interested in placing orders. Burkina Faso was no longer just a buyer. It was a manufacturer. Resistance and threats. But boldness comes at a cost. Several international organizations began warning that Burkina Faso was becoming increasingly isolated. Behind closed doors, diplomatic channels buzzed with quiet rage. A nation that was supposed to be dependent, poor, and manageable was now acting independent. There were threats, sanctions, even internal sabotage attempts. One shipment of imported ball bearings mysteriously vanished at the port, but none of it stopped the movement. The people were too involved now, too proud, too awake. Traoré doubled down. He ordered the establishment of a technical training school adjacent to the factory to teach youth mechanical engineering design and welding. His message was clear: they can block imports, but they can't block our minds. A factory forged in fire. By the end of the year, Burkina Faso wasn't just surviving the embargo, it was thriving through it. Food production began to rise again. Farmers who once feared the land were now leading cooperatives, armed with new machines and a new mentality. The first batches of coffee processed in locally built machines were sold at record prices across the region. And the tractor plant, it got a name: La Forge de l'Afrique, the Forge of Africa. For Ibrahim Traoré, it wasn't just about machines, it was about dignity, about showing the continent and the world that even the smallest country could roar back from silence, if it believed enough to build. It started as a whisper, then it became a rumor. Then, by the end of 2026, it was a headline: Burkina Faso is exporting tractors. Yes, tractors. Built in a factory that wasn't even on the map a year earlier. Machines designed, assembled, and tested by Burkinabe hands. The same country once dismissed as too poor to farm without aid was now fulfilling orders from across the Sahel. In Bamako, farmers stood in line to sign contracts. In Niamey, ministers asked to visit the plant that defied the embargo. The world expected Burkina Faso to fold. Instead, it had scaled up. By the first quarter of 2027, the national tractor factory, nicknamed La Forge de l'Afrique, was operating 2 shifts a day. New assembly lines were added for small irrigation pumps, motorized tillers, and soon, coffee sorters. Orders came in faster than they could produce, but something even more powerful was happening: a psychological shift. From desperation to dignity, farmers who once lined up for international food aid were now forming cooperatives. People who had never touched a wrench in their lives were now working on engines, calibrating belts, learning coding for control systems. In Koudougou, a woman named Aissata, once a mango vendor, was now managing inventory for the parts division. She told a visiting journalist, "I never thought I'd see the day when our country would be known, not for needing help, but for helping others farm." In towns across the country, children stopped drawing only footballs and flags. Now they drew tractors, and beside them they wrote 3 letters: BFA. Something deep was shifting, and it went far beyond economics. It was about pride. Africa watches. The story of Burkina Faso was no longer just a local miracle. It was becoming a continental blueprint. Documentaries were made. Independent YouTubers and African influencers flooded into the country to see the miracle factory. One Kenyan journalist said, "What's happening here feels like the beginning of something much bigger." They didn't just build a machine, they built a mindset. West African leaders, some of whom had previously criticized Traoré for his nationalist rhetoric, were now sending delegates with notebooks and cameras. They toured the training schools, spoke to farmers, and watched some in disbelief as machines built in Burkina Faso plowed through rock and sand like Western imports once did. The African Union held an emergency forum titled "Industrializing from Within Lessons from the Burkinabe Model." And for the first time in decades, a landlocked, often ignored nation was teaching others how to survive without handouts. The ripple effect Mali began drafting blueprints for its own small parts manufacturing unit. Niger started training mechanics with Burkinabe advisors. Guinea requested technical partnerships. Even countries outside the Sahel took note. Ghana's agriculture minister declared publicly, "We've spent decades importing what we could have built. Maybe it's time we look inward and look to Burkina Faso." But perhaps the most unexpected result was cultural. Artists began writing songs about the tractors. One viral music video featured a farmer dancing beside his machine with the chorus, "This is my power. This is my pride. This is Burkina." In marketplaces, children wore t-shirts with blueprints of local machines printed across their chests. Social media flooded with hashtags. built in Burkina, Sourier forge of Africa, we do not beg. The country was no longer just resisting pressure, it was exporting a new narrative. Die cite store the new problem demand. With fame came challenge. The orders from neighboring countries piled up faster than the factory could respond. Raw materials had to be sourced from within the continent. The demand for skilled labor skyrocketed. Engineers and fabricators worked overtime. There were bottlenecks, arguments, burnout. Even Traore admitted in a national address. This is no longer about survival. This is about scaling up without losing our soul. He ordered a second facility to be constructed near Bobo Dioulasso, this one focused entirely on agricultural processing machines. And he made a stunning announcement: Burkina Faso would launch its first Technical Institute of Agricultural Engineering, fully funded by national gold revenue. Where once gold was exported raw, now it was fueling machines that feed the people. The global glare. Of course, not everyone applauded. Certain Western outlets dismissed the entire endeavor as populist optics or unsustainable state intervention. Think tanks warned about over-centralization and nationalist overreach. Traore didn't respond with press releases, he responded with output. Every month, another 100 machines left the factory floor. Every week, another country asked for a tour, and every day, another Burkina family was reminded, we did this. Not the donors, not the loans, us. Legacy in motion. At the one-year anniversary of the embargo, Traore stood again in front of the factory gates. But this time, the scaffolding was gone. Behind him, flags of other African nations waved alongside the Burkina tricolor. The air was filled with the hum of engines. Cameras rolled. His speech was short. They tried to shut us down. We started something instead. And we are just getting started. The crowd, thousands of farmers, students, workers, elders roared. And far beyond Burkina Faso, millions watched. Not for spectacle, but for what it meant. That even the smallest, poorest country on a map can write a story that echoes across a continent. What began as a desperate reaction to a foreign blockade became something no one, perhaps not even Ibrahim Traoré himself, could have fully predicted. It became a movement, a model, a message that resonated across the globe. Africa doesn't have to wait. Africa doesn't have to beg. Africa can build. In a world that often talks down to the continent with terms like underdeveloped or aid-dependent, Burkina Faso's story hit like a hammer. And not just because of machines, but because of mindset. Burkina farmers didn't just get tractors, they got back their dignity. Engineers didn't just assemble machines, they designed blueprints of hope. And most importantly, young people so often told to dream of leaving, finally saw a reason to stay. The transformation wasn't magical, it was mechanical. Literal gears and bolts pulled a nation from the edge of collapse. Every clank of steel inside La Forge de l'Afrique echoed a deeper truth that development isn't about donations. It's about design, about doing, about daring. And the result, a small landlocked country with limited resources, became a source of strength for a whole region. It reminded everyone watching that sometimes pressure doesn't crush you, it forges you, just like steel. This wasn't just Burkina Faso's fight. It was symbolic of a broader African struggle to be seen not as a charity case, but as a creative force, one that can innovate, manufacture, and transform its own future. More and more African youth are now asking the same question: if Burkina can build its own tractors, why not us? If Ibrahim can say no to debt and yes to dignity, why not our leaders? And that is the real victory, not just in export numbers or factory output, but in changing the question from can we survive to how far can we go? Yes, there are critics. Yes, there will be hurdles. Yes, not every day will be a triumph. But let's be clear, Burkina Faso was never supposed to get this far. And yet it did. Against all odds, without foreign aid, without imported machines, without permission. And that's exactly why the world should pay attention. Because if one nation can rise on its own terms, then maybe, just maybe, the old rules no longer apply. The journey is not over. In fact, it's just beginning. Burkina Faso now faces new challenges: expanding capacity, maintaining quality, building sustainable supply chains, resisting corruption, and preparing the next generation to lead this industrial transformation. But if the last year has shown us anything, it's this: never underestimate a hungry farmer, a determined leader, and a people who've had enough of waiting. So here's where you come in. If this story moved you, if it made you rethink what's possible, if it made you proud to see Africa rise, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video. Comment your thoughts. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Because yes, there is a next chapter. We're working on a full follow-up about Burkina Faso's gold refinery, its plan to phase out raw exports, and how it's building a closed-loop economy. And trust me, you'll want to see it. But for now, remember this. In 2026, they tried to silence Burkina Faso by cutting off its machines. In 2027, Burkina Faso answered with the roar of an engine built by its own people. And that sound, that's the sound of a continent waking up. The story of Burkina Faso's rise from embargo-induced collapse to industrial awakening offers more than a tale of resilience. It delivers a masterclass in sovereignty, self-belief, and the true meaning of leadership. At its core lies one undeniable truth: development begins not with charity but with courage. The silence that once swept across Burkina Faso when coffee machines stopped, tractors rusted, and farmers sat helpless was not just economic. It was psychological. It was the silence of a people denied the tools to shape their own destiny. And yet from that very silence a new voice rose, not through speeches but through spark steel and the roar of a homemade engine. The first lesson is this: colonial dependence doesn't end with independence. It ends when a nation decides to create, not import. The West's embargo was surgical. It didn't bomb bridges or block food, it choked the machines. It took away the invisible lifelines of development: spare parts, processing tools, manufacturing equipment. By removing the tools of labor, it sought to reassert control without confrontation. Yet this calculated move unveiled an essential truth about modern power: those who control production control the future. Burkina Faso's leaders understood that aid is not empowerment. A tractor gifted is still a leash. A tractor built is a sword. Secondly, leadership is not about optics, it is about action. Ibrahim Traoré didn't flood social media with reactions, nor did he plead for international sympathy. He walked quietly to the epicenter of the pain, village by village, and listened. Then he built. His absence from public view wasn't retreat, it was preparation. And when he returned, it was not with promises but blueprints. His declaration, "We do not wait, we build," was more than a slogan. It was a declaration of war against helplessness. And the battlefield was not political theater, it was a dusty field in Dori. Another critical lesson emerges in the mechanics of the transformation itself. Building a factory is not about metal, it's about mindset. The construction of La Forge de l'Afrique, Burkina Faso's national tractor factory, was a physical manifestation of mental liberation. Volunteers didn't show up for wages. They showed up because for the first time, they believed they were building something that belonged to them. Retired blacksmiths, university engineers, and everyday citizens stood shoulder to shoulder under the sun, not for a paycheck but for pride. And with every bolt fastened, they dismantled the myth that Africa must always wait, beg, or borrow. Equally important is the lesson on symbolism. The factory became more than an industrial site. It became a sanctuary of national identity. Tractors, once the imported markers of dependency, were transformed into icons of resistance. Children drew them beside national flags. Musicians wrote songs about them. The very act of plowing the land became a statement of defiance. Burkina Faso wasn't just building machinery, It was manufacturing a new cultural narrative. It taught us that true transformation isn't measured in GDP growth alone. It is seen when the farmer stands taller, the child dreams bigger, and the nation believes deeper. Furthermore, the story exposes the vulnerability of Africa's current economic structure. By being so reliant on external machines, spare parts, and processing infrastructure, Burkina Faso was essentially outsourcing its survival. The West's embargo revealed the Achilles heel of import-dependent economies. When your tools are foreign, your future is hostage. But through crisis, the nation found an alternative model, one rooted in local production, regional solidarity, and intellectual sovereignty. By expanding its factory to include coffee processing machinery, Burkina Faso demonstrated that African nations don't need to accept industrial inferiority as a permanent state. One of the most profound lessons is that dignity is the true currency of development. When Burkina Faso workers dumped sacks of ripe coffee into rivers, they weren't mourning profits, they were mourning pride. Their tears were not for lost income, but for the humiliation of watching their labor rendered meaningless by distant boardrooms. The emergence of a locally built tractor wasn't just a logistical victory, it was a spiritual restoration. It gave the people a sense that they mattered, that their sweat was not disposable, and their future not negotiable. The ripple effects of this transformation offer yet another insight: revolutions aren't always loud. Sometimes they start with a whisper. Word of Traoré's efforts didn't spread through press conferences or state-run media. It moved through text messages, encrypted chats, and unfiltered testimonies. Ibrahim is building tractors, here, ours. That sentence carried more weight than any diplomatic rebuttal. It proved that change is contagious when it is visible and real. It also showed that true influence doesn't require a PR campaign, just a working engine and a willing people. Another essential takeaway is the redefinition of value. Gold, once exported raw, was redirected to fund technical schools. This shift challenges the long-held notion that African resources must always serve external markets. Burkina Faso inverted the paradigm. Instead of sending minerals abroad, they converted them into machinery that feeds their own people. This localized reinvestment of natural wealth reimagines the entire trajectory of resource-rich nations. It asks, what if we used what we have for who we are? The international backlash offers a sobering reality. Independence is threatening to those who profit from dependence. Western think tanks, media outlets, and policy experts called the Burkina Faso project unsustainable. But what they feared wasn't failure, it was success. Because success undermines the paternalistic architecture of the global aid system. It reminds the world that Africa doesn't need saviors, it needs sovereignty. And the greatest threat to the status quo is not rebellion, but competence. Lastly, the most enduring lesson is this mindset is infrastructure. A road can be rebuilt, a factory can be burned, but a liberated mind is ungovernable. The story of Burkina Faso didn't just change its economy, it changed the question, from can we survive without help, to how far can we go with our own hands. That question is now echoing across Africa, and that echo is louder than any engine. In the end, the lesson of Burkina Faso is not confined to its borders. It is an open invitation to any nation, any people asking whether dignity is worth fighting for. It reminds us that silence is not peace, waiting is not strategy, and hope, when welded into steel, can plow through the hardest ground. What Burkina Faso built was not just a tractor, it was a template. And now the whole world is watching. The story of Burkina Faso's tractor factory struck a deep chord across the African continent and beyond. Viewers didn't just watch it, they felt it. In the comment sections of online platforms and WhatsApp groups and in late-night conversations between friends, something shifted. People began to express a sense of ownership, admiration, and perhaps most importantly, reflection. The comments were not just about machinery or politics, they were about identity, agency, and the power of doing. One viewer from Ghana wrote, "For years we've been told that we can't, that we need aid, that we need Western expertise. And yet here is Burkina Faso showing us that we already have what we need: the will, the courage, the hands. This is not just about tractors. This is about proving that the African dream can be built with African steel. Another comment came from a Kenyan engineer who said, "I watched this with tears in my eyes. I've spent my whole life being told to go abroad to find better opportunities. But this story makes me want to go home and build." Maybe it's time we stop running and start creating. Burkina Faso is showing us how. Others focused on the emotional symbolism. A young woman from Côte d'Ivoire wrote, "When I saw the old farmer staring at his dead tractor, I saw my father. I saw his frustration, his helplessness. But when I saw that same country build a machine with its own hands, I saw a future I never thought possible." This isn't just about Burkina Faso. This is personal. Many viewers across the diaspora expressed a renewed sense of pride. One Nigerian in London commented, "This video shook me. All my life I've heard the same thing: Africa can't manage itself. But now I realize maybe we've just never been allowed to." Traore didn't ask for permission, he just started building. That's what leadership looks like. Some pointed out the contrast between Burkina Faso's dignity and the humiliation often seen in dependency. A user from South Africa remarked, "I'm tired of seeing African presidents begging at conferences." Traore didn't beg, he built. While others wait for debt relief, this man is building tractors with his people. That's the kind of strength our children need to see. Others commented on the silence that opened the crisis, the blockade, and how power operates in invisible ways. A Cameroonian university student noted, "The world didn't see this as violence because there were no bombs. But cutting off machines that feed a country is just as cruel. The West didn't shoot, but they strangled." And yet from that, Burkina Faso built life. That is revolutionary. Some responses were poetic in nature. One Ethiopian user wrote, "They tried to bury us with silence, but we grew roots and built engines. We turned rust into resolve. We turned embargo into blueprint. We turned despair into dignity." Many comments called for replication. "Mali, are you watching? Niger, are you ready? Senegal? What are we waiting for?" wrote one excited viewer. The sentiment echoed across threads. This is not the time to observe. This is the time to follow, to build, to reclaim. Several viewers also addressed the psychological transformation the story represents. "The most powerful part isn't the tractor. It's the mind that built it," said a user from Rwanda. "We've been taught to think small, to wait for approval, to believe we're not ready. But Burkina Faso proved we are. We've always been." Others saw the movement as a cultural awakening. One music producer from Lagos commented, "I'm going to sample the sound of that engine into my next track. That's the sound of power, the sound of rebirth. Let's make it our anthem." Even viewers from outside the continent weighed in. A Brazilian viewer said, "This reminds me of our own struggles, being told we're not enough unless we copy the West." But what Traore is doing is creating an original rhythm. It's deeply African, deeply human. Critics were not absent, but their tone revealed how unsettling true independence can be to the global system. One viewer sarcastically remarked, "I see the Western media are suddenly worried about unsustainable growth. Funny how they never say that about IMF loans." Another added, "They want Africa to be stable, but only if it's dependent. The moment we build, they panic." Still, most comments return to one recurring theme: dignity. A Burkinabe youth wrote, "I used to think our country was too small to matter. Now other nations are learning from us. I feel like I'm part of something historic, like I belong to something powerful." From humble farmers to tech-savvy students, the resonance was deep. "My father spent his life renting tractors from foreign companies," one young man said. "He died in debt. Today I watched a tractor built by our own people on our own soil. I cried. I'm not ashamed to say it." In marketplaces, teachers began using the story as an example in class. One teacher from Togo wrote, My students have been demoralized by poverty and politics. But after watching this, they asked if we could build something too. That's education. Some comments turned into calls for policy change. We need a Pan-African fund to support these kinds of projects, one activist posted. Let's redirect our aid dependency into innovation funding. Imagine 10 Laforge de l'Afrique factories across the continent. Among the most moving was a comment by an elderly man in his 70s. He wrote, "I didn't think I would live to see this. I was born under colonial rule. I saw coups, droughts, betrayals. But this feels different. This feels like the beginning of something we've waited for all our lives." And perhaps the most telling comment came from a teenager in Kinshasa. He didn't use fancy words or long sentences. He simply said, "I used to dream of leaving Africa. Now I dream of building something here." In the end, the comments were more than digital reactions. They were proof of a new consciousness taking root, a shift from silence to speech, from helplessness to hardware, from despair to design. Burkina Faso's journey didn't just spark admiration, it ignited imagination. And in every corner of Africa, people are now asking not, "Can we do it?" but "When do we start?" Because if a tractor can make people cry, then maybe it's more than a machine, maybe it's a mirror. And in that mirror, Africa is finally seeing its power.